Good morning. Winterview is back. Of course, driving to work. No! Why? Monday morning. Yeah. So, this morning's dialogue, once again for his dear friend, Annastacey. This dialogue is on the experience of thought. A topic that comes up very frequently in mental health. In fact, I'd say I spend most of my day with my clients talking about the experience of thought. A topic I find quite interesting. Often we hear in common everyday parlance, or put simply, everyday language, that I think, I'm thinking, I thought, and so on and so forth. However, on examination, it's often discovered that the I who thinks is uncertain. We don't know really if I is in fact thinking. But we could say that there is thought, the experience of thought. Thoughts are interesting in that they are automatic. They pop into one's awareness or consciousness out of nowhere, and the natural assumption is that I must have done that. But if you introspect even for a few seconds, it's very quick. It's quickly realized that that's a very gross misunderstanding of your own thinking process. In reality, if you sit and, meditate on this or just sit quietly with it, you'll discover that thoughts pop in and out of your awareness totally automatically, completely on automatic pilot, often in response to a stimulus. So, for example, it could be an external stimulus, something catches your eye, and you think about it. Or, now that we know that we don't think, it's thought about. The other point of stimulus can be internal cues. Thoughts can trigger other thoughts. And then, of course, there's just the random thinking for no apparent reason, just pops in, often daydreaming, wondering about the future. What about concerns? People with depression often suddenly find themselves depressively ruminating, as we say in psychology, on negative events from the past, or exaggerating negative events from their past. The first thing I'd like to discuss is the structure of thought. This is a topic that fascinates me within mental health. Structure of thought is interesting in that it completes in a way the experience or the illusory experience that you're looking out onto a world. Let me give you a simple example of what I mean. I'm driving at the moment and I might look to the horizon and say, oh, there's a lovely mountain range with a house nestled in the foreground. How scenic, how beautiful, I might think. How lovely. Wouldn't I like to live there, maybe? That entire sequence was a structure, a linguistic structure, you could even say, in thought. The illusion is that is what I just saw in an external world. That's not the case at all. What I saw in an external world and what I thought are two totally independent things. The fact that I thought a beautiful view and a house points to the structure of my own thinking. If I'd had a very peculiar upbringing where I didn't know what a house was for some strange reason, I'd never seen one perhaps, or perhaps I'd had a very bad experience in a house, or perhaps my intelligence wasn't so high, you might say, that I had trouble conceptualizing even the word house, it was just brick thing or something in my mind. What would happen then is the experience of thought would be completely different. Completely different. So when I look on the outside world, the thoughts that would arise in that case would not be, oh, beautiful view, there's a lovely house. It might be mountain brick thing. And that would be it. Mountain brick thing. And if I was to be asked at that exact moment, what was I looking at? I'd report mountain brick thing. There's a brick thing and a mountain. Whereas for me personally, I might report to a friend, I'm looking on a beautiful view. It's a lovely mountain range and there's a country house nestled in the foreground on a farm. Something like that maybe. Giving the appearance that that's actually what I'm seeing. But what I'm doing is just reporting on thought. I'm reporting on my imagination. So the experience of thinking seems to be personal, but in some ways it's just like looking out on a landscape and reporting what one sees. And this brings me to our next point, in that this changes the subjective landscape of experience radically. Once you understand that concept very, very well, you suddenly realize that what most people are experiencing and what most people are reporting is a highly subjective thought construct based not just on what they're looking at seemingly, but also on their understanding of what they're looking at. People are reporting in many ways their vocabulary, their history, their understanding / comprehension, their own thought structures. Thoughts are not merely benign clouds passing in the sky. They also trigger very powerful emotional states felt deep within the body, and conversely, deep, very powerful and primitive emotional states can trigger thoughts. Thoughts can trigger other thoughts. Other thoughts can trigger emotions and feelings in the body, and so on and so forth. And it unrolls or unravels like a very rich, interactive movie, giving the full personal, emotional experience of life. When someone comes into the clinic in the world of clinical psychology where I work, and as I've said in previous dialogues, the common top 2 complaints for most people are either depression or anxiety or both. They'll report to me their experience as if it's a shared reality, or as if it's a reality that I should immediately understand and recognize once they've told me the story. It could be a story that when they were young, they had terrible parents who weren't very nice, and then they had a lot of bad experiences at school, and then they had a big loss of some magnitude, and now, as a result, they're depressed. And the story makes sense, totally makes sense. But actually what they're reporting on is they're reporting on a thought story. They are experiencing that thought story themselves and then reporting it as if that thought story is reality. The reality in that thought story, and there is a reality, you might say, is the fact that there is a thought story and the feelings that marry up. The unreality is that the thought story literally represents reality. I hope I explained that well. So with the individual, say, who's experiencing depression or anxiety or both, they often want to argue the point that the thoughts that they experience really somehow are reality, that what they're talking to you about is the world, is reality. And any counselor, any psychologist worth their salt will recognize this immediately as a subjective reality. But of course, you have to be a little bit delicate there when you talk about this. You can't just tell them that they're delusional. And in some ways, they're not delusional. They are reporting on their experience. It's just that they've mistakenly thought that the thoughts are real. So in some ways, in clinical work, we can restructure, or even in some cases, provide a structure in order to have them think in a different way. When someone thinks in a different way, their experience is very different suddenly. And obviously, why wouldn't it be if you're thinking differently? The other thing to say about the experience of thought, and this is just an intuition on my part, that the body mechanism, the organism itself, is largely non-verbal. It's a very sort of affective, sensory, physical, emotional thing. And it has, you might say, survival needs, certain needs, eating, sleeping, sex, so on and so forth. And avoiding threat is a big part of it. The sensory apparatus, if you like, of the body has no... it's very primal. Its intelligence is exquisitely attuned to the survival of the organism. But the way that the sensory information is processed is often done in thought. So the thoughts that we have are often powerfully trying to represent deep, affective, emotional states or flashes, if you want, giving the impression, this is the hard bit to explain, giving the impression that the thoughts are somehow independent of that body. But actually, it's a story often based on that deep, emotional, affective, transient states. The thoughts are the translation, and then they are in some way understood. But we have to be very careful now. This is where it gets really dicey. It's true that the body is perhaps having emotional states, etc., for sure. But the translation of those emotional states is very subjective. And when I say very subjective, I understand that's a bit of a silly expression, but it's in some ways you're convinced when the thoughts arrive that what you're thinking is, let's call it, real or reality. But in most cases, it's the best guess translation work of your intelligence of the deep, affective, emotional states that you're experiencing. So you could be moved very powerfully with some deep sense of disturbance from the physiology. A cue might have triggered an alert, a cue beneath your awareness. You have no idea what triggered you. You know that the body is in an awful discomfort at the moment. And what happens next is where I think it gets fascinating. The thought story that is now generated out of that affective state is basically the end result of a narrative about you and your history and what this means and why it's there and what you need to do, etc., etc. There's a massive story generated out of that has a huge historical context in a personalized way for that individual that has no basis at all in reality. The only reality, you might say, is the fact that it's appearing. That is the reality. But the meaning, the heavily meaning-laden story, is totally made up. It's a total fiction. The affective transient emotional states, you could say, for sure they're part of the experience too. And there's, in broad terms, the body might just be experiencing a discomfort, but the narrative on the back of that discomfort is what people find distressing. That's where the distress is. So it could be, to give you a clinical example, I feel lonely today. No one likes me. No one's ever liked me. I don't have any friends. No one's ever shown much interest in me. I don't think I'm worth very much as a person. What's even the point of my life? And so on and so, a real fantasy tale generated, and of course there's the person in the middle who's apparently the source of all these problems. That's another big fat concept sitting there. So this wonderfully rich fantasy is generated, and that's the experience of thought there. That's what seems to, rather than saying I think blah blah blah, it's just that is the raw experience, if you like. And then this is hard in clinical work, in counselling, because the individual wants you to enter that story. They want you to enter their structure of thought with them and reassure them that the things that they're thinking about are okay, that I'm not lonely, really, that I am a good person, really, that there is hope for me, really. But this is where it's even more confounding, because that's all a fantasy. That's an entire fantasy. So am I, as a therapist, say, going to enter the fantasy world of the structure of your thought, and within that structure am I going to reassure you? Is that healthy? Should I be going in there and saying it's okay? I'm not going to answer that in this dialogue. That's a very big discussion. But the final thing I wanted to say on the experience of thought is that when it comes to the ideas and ideals of spirituality, of spiritual growth, say, spiritual progression and so forth, what a lot of people, like the people that come into the clinic, are powerfully feeling are a lot of negative, emotional, deep bodily affective states which are being translated by the structure of their thought, which includes a self-concept as the central point. And spirituality is yet another way to avoid or to get away from these deeply negative states. And the story becomes spiritualized in thought now. When I change the energy frequencies of my body, when I surrender my past, when I open myself to God, when I fast, when I become a vegetarian, when I meditate and so forth, when I still my mind, when I clear my chakras, etc., is the narrative coming out of the deep, mysterious emotional states of the body. And the reality of the thought, like any thought, is just the reality of the experience of that thought. The story within the thought is a fantasy. The fantasy, as we now know, is based on the intelligence of the organism, the ability to translate those emotional states. Once the individual translates the emotional states. Now, this all happens outside of conscious awareness. The translation process, the thoughts, I beg your pardon, are the net result of that translation process. And now that we've had the thoughts, now that we've believed the thoughts to be real, we're now going to try and address our problems within the structures of our own thought. So how does that work? That's a fantasy. That's an absolute fantasy. And even these dialogues that you're listening to, if you are listening to them, are fantasies. These are the structures of my thought. And the structure of my thought is no more real than the structure of any other thought. So in some ways you're entering my fantasy world, listening to these dialogues and taking them to be literal or real in some way. The translation process can go two ways, however. Listening to my thoughts or someone else's can be translated back into affective, emotional responses within the physiology and can be felt as pleasant, unpleasant, so on and so forth. So this brief dialogue was to flag the way that thought is experienced. Rather than thinking I think, you can just say thought was experienced. And now when it comes to the content of the thoughts themselves, I hope you have a better understanding that even the content, whilst it's as an experience is real, the content itself is a fantasy based on your own, or based on the body's intelligence, history, understanding, ability to understand, etc. And that relates across the board, not just in clinical matters, but in so-called spiritual and religious matters as well. And where does that leave you? Back to that big, fat mystery. The mystery is we don't know what's happening, really. We don't know what's going on, or rather we could say the only thing we know is the experience of that thought. That's what is known, but that's not much. That's like watching a movie and now saying, now I know what's going on in the world because of the movie. Anyway, time for a coffee. Time to take a break and relax before I get to work. This has been Winterview. Comments are welcome.